Secrets, if you really look at yourself, you would be speechless. What happened to being doctors and teachers? What happened to being your brother's keeper? Nowadays, kids more work.
Coming up next on BandClapTv.
Pikachu, use Thunderbolt!
In the Japanese version of Pokemon, Ash was actually named after the creator of Pokemon, Satoshi. And in Japan, Satoshi represents wisdom or reason. Sounds pretty Virgo-ish, doesn't it? So now, since we know that Ash Ketchum represents Satoshi, which means wisdom or reason, which represents the creator, who is a double Virgo, it is very, very not a stretch to say that Ash Ketchum represents the baby Eshu, just in a different way. Because if you've been following me on my channel, I talk about the baby Eshu a lot. How the baby Eshu is always in the forest, making new friends, going through different things and learning along the way. And just like how the baby Eshu has the warriors, in which each of the warriors, they all have their own specialties, they all have their own purpose, and they all have their own reason for being in the warriors. Just like with Ash and his friends. All of his friends are journeying with Ash for different reasons. They all got different purposes and they all have different things that they want to learn and all of that. But it's Ash whose main objective of going on this journey is to become a Pokemon master. So before I really start talking about and breaking down the premise of Pokemon and how it represents the Pimp and the Prophet as well, let's look at some androgyny examples, even when we talk about the little bit that I've explained already about the Pokemon animated series, being that the voice of Ash Ketchum has always been voiced by a woman, mainly this woman named Veronica Taylor. She is a Life Path 11, born on the 9th of April, 1978. She is a Taurus moon, like the baby Oshun, and she's also a Aries sun, which is a very, very divine Pambagira type of mix, just when we're talking about personality. So the team of Satoshi, the writer, and Veronica Taylor being the voice of the main character, Ash, this shows you, even on a cartoonist type of standpoint, the baby Oshun and the baby Eshu connection. And it's funny because when we were kids, I don't think none of us were turned off by the notion of if Ash's voice actor was a boy or a girl. It's like we didn't even care. And a lot of us, we were so shocked when we found out that Ash has never had a male voice actor. But it didn't turn us off from the series and made us not want to watch it anymore. And I remember even when she was replaced because of different organizations trying to cut corners and save money, so they didn't want to keep paying the original voice actors and stuff like that, there was a really big petition put in place to try to bring Miss Taylor back, but it ended up falling through. So even when we look at Veronica and her natal chart and just her as a person, because when you hear her talking about her character as Ash, you hear, and not only that, you see this childlike essence in her that makes her such a lovely person, not only to be around, but I bet she was a very lovely person to work with as well. And you kind of see when you listen to her in her interviews and in her seminars, when she talks about her 8 years of being Ash Ketchum, how she pretty much developed such a liking to that character that when she was given the news that she was going to be replaced, she was devastated. So that shows you how a lot of these voice actors, they really pour their heart and soul into the characters that they're working with, simply because energetically they can relate to these characters so much, because it's nothing but an aspect of themselves. And it's like, think about it. Who can portray the most and give you a damn near spot on rendition of the baby Eshu than the baby Oshun? Because for the most part, she's always around him and vice versa. So it was a no-brainer finding out who Veronica was and how she was just able to embody that Ash Ketchum character the way she did. Even though Ash Ketchum was a 10-year-old boy. And that's the beautiful thing when it comes to these Hollywood cartoons and movies and stuff, which is all a form of trickery and manipulation. But as you can see, not all trickery and manipulation is something that's going to give you a negative or a bad effect on you, when you find out the secret behind the trick. And also, since we're just talking about Mercury, you see here that even Satoshi, his Mercury is in Leo, and it's in his 5th house, which is where Leo is the most exalted, which is where Oshun is the most exalted when she's in her Leo state, the Queen Yalorde. And it was destined for him to use his communication to be able to create something that was so spectacular, something that's going to stand the test of time even after his death with the Pokemon series. Because as you can see, his North Node is in his 3rd house, which is in Gemini. So that's why I'm able to decode this series like I can, because when Satoshi created Pokemon, he created this out of his own mindset of life and how he looked at life. And this is the reason why, as a child, we were always so fascinated with Pokemon. So with that being said, we pretty much concluded that Ash Ketchum represents the baby Eshu. And when we think about it, this is the version of the baby Eshu that represents the prophet. And with this, Ash will naturally take the path that is less traveled. And just like a lot of us baby Eshus, Ash, from the second that he went to Professor Oak, because remember, he was late getting there, Ash has always been underestimated. So it's like every time Ash gets a victory in his journey, it is so motivating. Every time Ash gets a victory in his journey, it is very, very motivating, because he always does it in a very unconventional type of way. And it's usually in a way that logically it's not even supposed to work. And that's the realm that Eshu really, really loves to deal with, because when he does these miraculous things, it wows people so much, because we're always kind of fixated on things happening a certain way or things going a certain way. So when something or someone comes from way left field and shows you that this thing can be done in a different way, it is always something that is going to stick with you. And that's what Ash's character teaches you. Remember, Ash was born in Pallet Town. We know that that's where Ash's adventure starts, and that's where his home is, and all of these things. And we know that he lives with his mother, Delilah Ketchum, and his father has already went on the journey that Ash is about to go on as well, to be a Pokemon master. And when we talk about the Eshus of the world from a lower level earthly standpoint, you see this type of situation all the time. You got the black single mother raising a black son, and that son is raised up in an environment where the feminine energy, even though it's at a lot of times low vibrational, that female energy is very, very dominant in that area. And just like Ash, in a lot of times at an early age, that black boy would end up getting with some other black boys that he feel like are more knowledgeable than him, that can teach him something. And he wants to leave the house of the single mother and go out in the streets, aka in the jungle, and learn the ways of how to generate currency through learning how to manipulate a woman's nature, so that all he has to do is to command what he needs out of those said women, and they go out and do the quote-unquote battling, aka turning tricks, and then they come back, aka return to that said pimp with the currency that they ended up collecting after the deed was done. And since that pimp is in a very, very dangerous jungle-like situation, a lot of the lessons that a lot of the normal people would have to learn multiple times in order for them to get it, that pimp that's out there in the jungle, he has to learn these things very, very quickly, because in his line of work, you don't really have a lot of chances to make mistakes, because one false move and your whole operation can be compromised, and now you're sent upstate to prison and your whole life is over. So the friends that this pimp ends up meeting with while he's in the jungle, they become very, very close. But that pimp understands that for the most part, this is still a self journey. This is still something that he can't necessarily depend on any person to do this the way it needs to be done. The only person that he can depend on to do that is himself. So since he doesn't have those type of codependency issues, he can accept these friends that he meets along his journey in the jungle for who they are. But he doesn't grow such an attachment to those said friends when it's time for those friends to go their separate ways, because the pimp is always evolving with the times. He's always evolving, and he's always got his ears to the streets, because if anybody has to make sure that they're up to date when it comes to the new laws in place, when it comes to the nuances of things that's going on in the world that may affect the morality, or it may affect different things when it comes to the women that he has. If anybody needs to make sure that they stay on top of that, it's the pimp, because you always have to be that leader. And in order to be a leader, you have to always be at least 10 steps ahead of your followers, because if your followers feel like they can catch up with you at any point, then one of them is going to end up coming up with that bright idea of, why am I following this person? And that's a very parasitic type of thought that could end up leading to a lot of damage going on. Now, this is the thing that the pimp understands, that the player, or the pretty boy, or the modern day guy that claims that he got all the women he can have sex with, 100 women, all of this type of stuff. This is something that the pimp understands, because he's not just in it for the sexual pleasure. He can care less about that, because the only thing that's on the pimp's mind is not only how can we maximize the currency that's being exchanged, but the pimp, especially a really, really good pimp, he takes a lot of his time just examining the psyche of not only the women that he has doing his work for him, but just the psyche of a woman's nature in general, which, just like Pokemon, is ever changing, it's ever evolving, and you'll never truly be able to say that you know a woman's nature inside and out 100%. Just like it's impossible for you to catch every single Pokemon. And with this being said, it is very, very damn near impossible. I would say it's impossible for you to be able to fully study a rotation of 20, 30, 40 women. It's damn near impossible, because someone who really, really wants to take the time to study the ins and outs of the woman that they're with, that takes a lot of time. That's just with one woman. So imagine if you're a pimp and say you got a stable of 5 women. In order for you to be a 100% effective pimp, where you damn near don't even have to use brute force in order to get things through to your women, because as a pimp that knows himself, he understands what he's gonna tolerate and what he's not gonna tolerate. So if he sees a woman, and they call them renegade hoes, if he sees a woman that has that very, very fierce, Oya, untamable, sekhmet type of energy, no matter how sexy she is, no matter how tantalizing she is, and she might look like a woman that if you try to get her on your team, she could probably pull a lot of tricks for you. But a smart pimp, he wouldn't even deal with a woman like that, because he understands how much headache that's gonna be. And if we're being honest with you, if you got a pimp and he got a stable of 5 very, very loyal women, it's because he studied them psychologically, astrologically, and all of these different things, even if it's subconsciously, that all of these 5 women that he got in his stable has some type of compatible baby Oshun type of energy within them, because they're the most loyal and they have that fierce Pambagera side in them too. But it's not like the untamable and very fierce type of that energy when it comes from Oya. Now, I'm not saying that Oyas in a lower level can't be hoes, because there is a such thing called the gorilla pimp. And the gorilla pimp is the type of pimp that is publicized the most in media and movies and stuff like that. The gorilla pimp, they gotta beat on their hoes every minute in order to make them submit to him. And that was the first type of pimp that was outlawed, and the gorilla pimp pretty much made the block hot for all of the other types of pimps, because truth be told, not every pimp was beating on their women. That's just something that you see in the media. That's just something that you've seen in movies and you've heard in records and stuff like that. But the real pimps, the real stump down pimps, a lot of them knew things like psychology. A lot of these pimps were a whole lot more advanced mentally and logically and psychologically. They were a lot more advanced than the world would want to give them credit, simply because anything that has to do with a melanated man being highly intelligent, being able to wield the power of the black woman, and even the white woman too, that is a very dangerous man, an extremely dangerous man. Even if we're talking about the lowest level of communication, which was sex, and the lowest level of currency, which is paper money. And in a lot of cases, especially when the pimp gets a lot older, he too can turn his life around and be the prophet. Or when it comes to a lot of these pimps, in a lot of cases, the prophet is the only person that pimp feels like it can confide in And the prophet doesn't judge the pimp because the prophet understands that the pimp and the prophet are the same person. It's just they took a different path at the crossroads. Now, how does this, talking about the pimp, how does this relate to Ash and his journey of being a Pokemon master? Now, remember, Ash represents the baby Eshu. He is voiced by a version of Oshun, Veronica Taylor, which shows you that Ash himself is an androgynous child, not a gay child, not a homosexual LGBT child, a androgynous child, which means that even though Ash on a worldly level, since he's innocent hearted and he's pure hearted, Ash is looked at as very weak. He's looked at as very corny, very stubborn, all the things that the baby Eshu and the baby Oshun have in common when they're babies. Ash started out on his journey with all the chips against him, the same way that the pimps and the prophets a lot of times have to go through life, because as a prophet in this world of sin, it's always a battle trying to keep your faith and to not be tempted by the evils of this world. Now, this Pokemon series, as you're going to see, it's multi-layered. There's a lot of different ways I can tweak this story, and each way that I tweak the story is still going to make sense in however I do it. So Ash, or Satoshi, means the black child with wisdom and reason. Ash and his mother is voiced by the same person. Ash and his mother is voiced by the same person. Keep that in your back pocket. Ash comes from Pallet Town. Why is this important? Simply because the Japanese version of Pallet Town is actually translated to Masara Town. So looking a little bit deeper in the Japanese translations of this Masara word, it can mean to excel, it can mean intelligent or victorious, but in Africa, Masara actually means a magical woman or a sorceress. Makes a lot of sense, don't it? Doesn't all of these things represent the Queen of Virgo? I'm just saying. And also, doesn't all of these things represent Ayazan and all of the goddesses that I was talking about in my Ayazan video that represented the earth and nature and all of these different things? Remember, I said that Ayazan can be known as Eshu's wife or mother. Hence, Ash and Ash's mom is voiced by the same person. Now, even though there's a lot of rumors and a lot of speculation when it comes to Ash's dad, because we don't really see or hear of anything about Ash's dad, and Ash's mom talked about him very briefly in one sentence in the first episode of Pokemon called Pokemon I Choose You. And I'm gonna break that phrase down as well. But just like in the pimp's life, when the pimp is a little boy, a lot of times there's a older Obatala type of man that gives that boy some game about how to be a pimp. And just like how Ash looked up to Professor Oak, which we're gonna break that down, that's the same way that that little boy, since a lot of these men don't grow up with fathers in their lives, that little boy looks up to that old pimp, that old player, and soaks up all the game that he's willing to give him. Because when we talk about Gary, which was Professor Oak's grandson, Gary, in a lot of ways, he represents how the mass media and pretty much this social climate, Gary is how the pimp, the player, the Chad, Brad, Tyrone, Pookie, Ray Ray, Gary, in a lot of ways, he represents all of them in one, but he represents the person that decides to take his road based on ego, which a lot of feminists will call toxic masculine. While Ash, on the other hand, since he was raised by his mother in a town that has the energy of magical femininity, Ash, he takes another path, which is a more spiritual, enlightening type of path. Because with Ash wanting to learn how to be a Pokemon master, Ash really doesn't have that type of drive to quote unquote catch them all, unlike his nemesis Gary does. Now, this is another thing that y'all probably didn't think about, because we know that Pallet Town is a small town that is located in the southwestern Kanto region. And this is important simply because when you look up the Japanese definition of Kanto, Kanto means east of the border. It means east of the border, okay? So it's very, very safe to assume, because we know that in a lot of different definitions, if you're facing north, which when you see on this map, Pallet Town is in the middle and is facing north. You gotta go north in order to start your journey. As you can see on this map, Ash is already starting out on the right side. This is why Ash is so childlike and he still acts like a child. But his journey is gonna be the left-hand path, and all my Gnostics out there, you know what I mean when I say the left-hand path. So Ash's journey, even though he started on the right hand, his real journey starts when he goes to the left-hand path. Because in order for you to turn around and go up to the Indigo Plateau, where the Pokemon League is, as you can see, you gotta go all the way to the other side first. You gotta go all the way to the left side to even start the journey. So a lot of times when we talk about the Prophet, since in a lot of cases, the Prophet had a much more holistic upbringing than what the Pimp may have had. The Prophet, in his younger years, he went through some things as well. But since it wasn't as extreme as what the Pimp had to go through in his younger years, it's easy for us to look down on the Prophet's adventure and vice versa. But what you learn is the reason why, in the end, the Pimp and the Prophet helps each other is simply because they find out that they literally went through a lot of the same things that got them to the enlightened version of themselves that they ended up being in their later years of their life. So when we see Ash at the beginning of his journey, because it talks about how it was when Ash